I wrote a letter home to my sister. Don't expect me to come home. I expected to die.
In the dead of night, miles above enemy territory, some figures leap from the belly of a military aircraft, swallowed instantly by the darkness. No roaring engines, no flashing lights, just the sound of the wind rushing past as they plummet toward the earth.
Skies alive with enemy planes and American bullets and shells, and here's where they meet.
This isn't just any jump, it's a carefully planned infiltration. US paratroopers use extreme high-altitude jumps to slip behind enemy lines undetected, often employing HALO, high-altitude low opening, or HAHO, high-altitude high opening techniques. These methods allow them to cover vast distances in free fall or glide silently for miles, avoiding radar detection and enemy patrols. Join us as we take you through missions US paratroopers have jumped on over the years. Operation Neptune, 1944. It was June 6, 1944. The world was at war, and the Allied forces, which included the US, Britain, and other countries, were preparing to attack Nazi Germany in France. This attack would be known as D-Day, the biggest invasion in history. But before the main soldiers could land on the beaches, something very important had to happen. A group of brave paratroopers from the 101st Airborne Division and the 82nd Airborne Division had to jump behind enemy lines, deep inside Nazi-controlled France. Their job was to capture bridges, destroy enemy weapons, and stop German soldiers from reaching the beaches where the main attack would happen. This jump was important, because without them, the enemy could send reinforcements and destroy the invasion before it even started. The planes flew low over France, dodging enemy fire. The paratroopers inside could hear bullets flying past. Then, the red light in the plane turned green. It was time to jump. One by one, hundreds of paratroopers leaped into the dark sky, their parachutes opening above them. They floated down toward enemy territory, landing in fields, forests, and even swamps. This wasn't their initial landing plan. Things didn't go as planned. Many paratroopers were dropped in the wrong places because of the heavy fog and enemy attacks. Some landed far from their teams. Others got stuck in trees or drowned in flooded fields. But that didn't make them give up. Even in the chaos, these soldiers gathered their teams, found their weapons, and started their mission. The paratroopers worked fast and in secret. They cut enemy phone lines, blew up bridges, and set up roadblocks to stop the Germans from sending more troops. They also fought off enemy soldiers, even though they were outnumbered. In one famous battle, a group of 101st Airborne soldiers defended a small village called Sainte-Mère-Église from German attacks. This village became one of the first places in France to be freed from Nazi control. By morning, the paratroopers had done their job. They had confused and slowed down the Germans, making it easier for the soldiers landing on the beaches to move forward. D-Day was still a bloody battle, but without the paratroopers, it could have been a disaster. These brave paratroopers had jumped into the unknown, risking their lives to help change the course of history. Because of them, the Allies were able to start pushing the Nazis out of France and eventually win the war. Operation Market Garden, 1944. Imagine a soldier is running across a bridge, but behind him, enemy soldiers are chasing fast. His team has only a few moments to stop them before they take over. The bridge is the only way forward, and if you lose it, the whole mission could fail. This is what it was like for US and British paratroopers during Operation Market Garden, which is one of the most daring airborne missions of World War II. It was a cold September 17th of the year 1944. The war in Europe had been going on for 5 years, and the Allies, the US, Britain, and others had pushed the Nazis out of France. Now they wanted to move quickly into Germany and end the war before Christmas. But there was a problem. A series of big rivers and bridges in the Netherlands stood in their way. If the Germans destroyed those bridges, the Allies would be trapped. So, the leaders came up with a bold plan. thousands of paratroopers would jump deep into enemy territory, land near key bridges, and hold them until reinforcements arrived. The US 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions would take the lower bridges, while the British 1st Airborne Division would go for the final and most important one, the bridge at Arnhem. If this worked, the Allies could quickly roll into Germany and win the war. But if they failed, they would be stuck in enemy land, surrounded by German soldiers. Just like in Operation Neptune, the paratroopers boarded huge planes and flew over enemy lines. When they jumped, their parachutes filled the sky, thousands of white canopies floating toward the ground. At first, everything seemed to go well. The American paratroopers landed safely and quickly took control of their assigned bridges. They fought off German soldiers and held their positions, waiting for tanks and more soldiers to arrive. But the British paratroopers at Arnhem weren't so lucky. The plan had one big mistake. They didn't know that elite German soldiers were waiting near Arnhem. The British 1st Airborne Division landed far from the bridge and had to fight through enemy forces to get there. A small group of them managed to reach it and held it for days, but they were running out of supplies. No food, no water, no bullets. The German forces surrounded them, attacking from all sides. The British sent desperate messages over the radio. "We're holding on, but we need help." But the reinforcements couldn't reach them in time. After 9 days of brutal fighting, the British were forced to retreat. The final bridge, the one they needed the most, remained in German hands. What went wrong? Operation Market Garden was one of the biggest airborne battles in history, but it didn't go as planned. The American paratroopers succeeded in capturing their bridges, but without Arnhem, the road to Germany was still blocked. The war continued for months longer, and many soldiers lost their lives. Even though the mission failed, the bravery of the paratroopers became legendary. They had jumped into enemy land with nothing but their courage and fought against overwhelming odds. Their sacrifice showed the world what true heroism looks like. Operation Varsity, 1945. This was the largest single-day airborne operation to cross the Rhine and break into Nazi Germany, flying high above enemy land in a big, noisy plane. Below the paratroopers, explosions light up the ground. Their parachute is strapped tight, your hands grip your rifle, and your heart pounds as the plane doors open. At times, they take a deep breath and jump. This was the experience of US and British paratroopers during Operation Varsity, the largest airborne assault ever done in a single day. This happened on March 24, 1945. World War II was nearing its end, but the Germans were still fighting hard. Their allies, the US, Britain, and others, had pushed them all the way back to the Rhine River, the last big obstacle before entering Germany. Crossing the Rhine River was dangerous. The Germans had set up heavy defenses with machine guns, tanks, and artillery ready to stop any invasion. The Allies needed a way to break through fast. That's where the paratroopers came in. The plan was simple, but extremely risky. Over 16,000 paratroopers from the US 17th Airborne Division and Britain's 6th Airborne Division would jump behind enemy lines, capture key areas, and destroy German defenses. This would weaken the enemy so that the main Allied forces could cross the river safely. At dawn, more than 1,500 planes and gliders filled the sky, the biggest airborne operation in history. As the paratroopers jumped, German soldiers fired at them from below. Many were hit before they even reached the ground. Some landed in the wrong places, while others got tangled in trees or power lines. Despite the chaos, the paratroopers fought hard. They quickly captured bridges, roads, and enemy bunkers. They blew up German supply stations, cut telephone lines, and set up defensive positions. This was one of the toughest battles at a small village called Hamminkeln. The Germans fought fiercely, trying to push the paratroopers back, but the airborne troops held their ground, fighting street by street until they took control. By the end of the day, the mission was a success. The paratroopers had secured their targets, and the main Allied army was able to cross the Rhine without being stopped. This was the beginning of the final push into Germany. Less than 2 months later, the war in Europe was over. Operation Junction City, 1967. This is the only major combat jump of the Vietnam War. This war targeted Viet Cong strongholds in South Vietnam. By 1967, the Vietnam War was at its peak. The Viet Cong, communist fighters from North Vietnam, had been using the jungles of South Vietnam to launch surprise attacks. They would strike US forces and then disappear into hidden tunnels before they could be caught. To stop them, the US military planned Operation Junction City, one of the biggest missions of the war. Over 25,000 American and South Vietnamese troops were sent to attack the enemy's headquarters in the War Zone C region, near the Cambodian border. The goal was to trap and destroy the Viet Cong, capture their supplies, and shut down their secret tunnels. On February 22, 1967, more than 800 paratroopers from the 173rd Airborne Brigade boarded their planes. This was the first and only major parachute assault of the entire Vietnam War. As their planes flew over the jungle, they jumped into the sky, their parachutes popping open one by one. But this was not like jumping into an open field. The jungle was thick and full of dangers. The Viet Cong were not easy to find. They had tunnels hidden underground where they could hide, store weapons, and even set traps. The US troops had to fight through booby traps, ambushes, and sudden attacks from the trees. For weeks, the soldiers searched the jungle, destroying enemy bases and uncovering tunnels. They fought in brutal battles, pushing the Viet Cong back. At one point, they found an underground city, a huge tunnel system with sleeping areas, hospitals, and storage rooms. The Viet Cong had been living right under their feet. Did it work? Operation Junction City lasted for 72 days, making it one of the longest battles of the Vietnam War. The US forces destroyed many Viet Cong bases and tunnels, but the enemy was not completely defeated. The Viet Cong simply moved deeper into the jungle, and the war continued for years. Even though the mission didn't fully stop the enemy, Operation Junction City proved that airborne troops could still play a big role in modern war. It was also the last time US soldiers jumped into combat on such a large scale. Those paratroopers who jumped that day were part of history, showing courage, skill, and determination in one of the toughest wars ever fought. Operation Just Cause, 1989. US paratroopers from the 82nd Airborne Division conducted airborne assaults to oust Panamanian dictator Manuel Noriega. Panama is a small country in Central America, home to the Panama Canal, an important waterway that connects the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. This canal is one of the most valuable trade routes in the world, and the US had helped build and control it for years. But Panama's leader, Manuel Noriega, had become a problem. He was accused of working with drug cartels, smuggling illegal drugs into the US, and even ordering attacks on American soldiers stationed in Panama. After years of tension, the US decided it was time for regime change. Noriega had to go. On December 20th, 1989, the US launched Operation Just Cause. They sent over 27,000 troops into Panama. It was one of the largest US military operations since the Vietnam War. A key part of the mission was a massive airborne assault.
There's a dive bomber coming right at them.
Over 1,000 paratroopers from the 82nd Airborne Division boarded transport planes flying toward Panama under the cover of darkness. Their job: jump into enemy territory, take control of strategic locations, and secure the country before Noriega could escape. At 1 a.m., the sky over Panama filled with parachutes as the soldiers dropped toward the ground. They landed near Tocumen International Airport, a critical target, and quickly moved to capture airfields, block enemy roads, and secure government buildings. The Panamanian Defense Forces, PDF, loyal to Noriega, fought back, but they were no match for the US troops. Within hours, the Americans had taken control of major cities and military bases. Helicopters, special forces, and ground troops joined the fight, overwhelming the Panamanian army. Meanwhile, Noriega was on the run. He first hid in the Vatican embassy, hoping to escape capture, but after 10 days, he finally surrendered to US forces and was flown to the US, where he was put on trial for drug trafficking and other crimes. By January 1990, the US had restored order in Panama, helping install a new government. Operation Just Cause was one of the fastest and most successful airborne missions in US history. This mission proved that airborne forces were still one of the most powerful tools in modern warfare. It also showed how quickly the US military could move in and remove a dangerous leader. Even today, Operation Just Cause is remembered as one of the last major combat jumps of the 20th century, a mission where paratroopers changed the fate of a nation in just a few hours. Operation Gothic Serpent, 1993. In the early 1990s, Somalia, an East African country, was in chaos. A brutal warlord named Mohammed Farah Aidid had taken control of Mogadishu, the capital city. His fighters, called the Somali National Alliance, SNA, were attacking peacekeepers and stealing food meant for starving people. The United Nations and the US tried to stop him, but Aidid refused to back down. In 1993, the US sent special forces, including Army Rangers and Delta Force, to capture him and his top commanders. This mission was called Operation Gothic Serpent. On October 3, 1993, US forces planned a daring airborne assault. Using helicopters and fast-roping techniques, they would storm a building in Mogadishu, where Aidid's men were meeting, capture them, and leave in less than an hour. It was supposed to be quick and easy, but things didn't go as planned. The mission started well. Special forces fast-roped from helicopters, stormed the building, and captured Aidid's men. But then, a Black Hawk helicopter was shot down by a rocket-propelled grenade, RPG. Instead of leaving quickly, the soldiers had to stay and rescue the crash survivors. Minutes later, a second Black Hawk was hit and crashed in another part of the city. Now, the mission has turned into a full-scale battle. Thousands of armed Somali fighters surrounded the Americans. The narrow streets made it hard to move, and the enemy had the advantage. US soldiers fought their way to the crash sites, but the battle was brutal. Bullets flew from rooftops and alleyways, and every move was dangerous. One of the most heroic moments came when Delta Force snipers Gary Gordon and Randy Shughart volunteered to defend the second crash site alone. They held off enemy fighters as long as they could, but were eventually overwhelmed. Both were awarded the Medal of Honor for their bravery. The battle lasted over 15 hours. By morning, the US forces finally received reinforcements and fought their way out of the city. Many soldiers had to run miles back to safety, dodging enemy fire the entire way. By the end of the battle, 18 US soldiers were dead, and more than 70 were wounded. The Somali casualties were in the hundreds. The shocking images of American soldiers being dragged through the streets were broadcast worldwide, leading to a huge debate in the US about military involvement in Somalia. After this, the US withdrew from Somalia, and Aidid remained in power for several more years. Operation Enduring Freedom, 2001. Special forces and airborne troops infiltrated Afghanistan to dismantle the Taliban and al-Qaeda networks. They flew high above rugged mountains, knowing that below you is enemy territory. These paratroopers were strapped into their parachute, rifle ready, heart pounding. The doors of the plane open, freezing air rushes in, and suddenly they jump. This is how US paratroopers entered Afghanistan in 2001, launching Operation Enduring Freedom, the mission to destroy the Taliban and hunt down Osama bin Laden. On September 11, 2001, the world changed forever. Terrorists from the group Al-Qaeda, led by Osama bin Laden, hijacked planes and attacked the United States, killing nearly 3,000 people. The US quickly discovered that bin Laden was hiding in Afghanistan, protected by the ruling Taliban government. President George W. Bush demanded that the Taliban hand over bin Laden. When they refused, the US launched Operation Enduring Freedom, a military mission to remove the Taliban from power and destroy terrorist networks. On October 19, 2001, US paratroopers from the 75th Ranger Regiment and Delta Force carried out a daring airborne assault into Afghanistan. This was one of the first combat jumps of the war. Flying in at night, the paratroopers jumped from C-130 planes into an airfield near Kandahar, a key Taliban stronghold. Their mission was to capture the airfield, destroy enemy defenses, and prepare for larger forces to arrive. The Taliban were caught off guard. The paratroopers hit the ground, moved quickly, and secured the area before the enemy could react. Within hours, the airfield was under US control, giving American forces a base to launch further attacks. After the first successful airborne assault, US forces, along with Afghan allies, launched major offensives against the Taliban. Airstrikes, ground battles, and special forces raids helped push the Taliban out of power within a few months. But the war was far from over. The Taliban and Al-Qaeda fighters escaped into the mountains, hiding in caves and remote villages. One of the most intense battles came in March 2002, during Operation Anaconda, where US troops fought a brutal mountain battle against Taliban forces. For years, US forces continued fighting the Taliban, searching for bin Laden and training Afghan soldiers. The war stretched on for 2 decades, becoming the longest conflict in US history. Finally, in May 2011, US Navy SEALs found and killed Osama bin Laden in Pakistan. But the war in Afghanistan continued for another 10 years. In August 2021, after 20 years, the US military finally withdrew from Afghanistan. Soon after, the Taliban regained control of the country. This operation was one of the most important missions in modern history. It was the first response to September 11th, showing that the US would fight back against terrorism. The paratroopers who jumped into Afghanistan in 2001 were among the first to enter this long war. Their mission was dangerous, but it helped lay the foundation for 2 decades of military operations against terrorist groups. Even though the war's ending was controversial, their bravery and sacrifice will never be forgotten. Operation Anaconda, 2002. By 2003, tensions between the US and Iraq were at a breaking point.
So, they took him out.
The US government, led by President George W. Bush, accused Iraq's dictator Saddam Hussein of hiding dangerous weapons and supporting terrorists. Although many countries questioned the evidence, the US decided to remove Saddam from power. On March 20, 2003, the US and its allies launched the Iraq War, also called Operation Iraqi Freedom. The main attack came from the south, through Kuwait. But there was a problem. The US needed to secure northern Iraq to prevent Saddam's army from escaping or regrouping. This was when the big jump into Iraq happened. To take control of northern Iraq, the US military planned a massive airborne assault. The 173rd Airborne Brigade was chosen for the mission. Their job: jump into Iraq, seize a key airfield, and hold it until reinforcements arrive. On March 26, 2003, over 1,000 paratroopers boarded transport planes in Italy and flew for 4 hours toward Iraq. This was one of the longest airborne missions in history. As the planes reached their target, the Bashar airfield, the paratroopers jumped into the night sky. Hundreds of parachutes filled the air, and within minutes, the US had landed deep inside enemy territory. The paratroopers landed with minimal resistance. Unlike past battles, Saddam's forces were caught by surprise and didn't put up a major fight. The 173rd quickly secured the airfield and prepared for enemy counterattacks. Within hours, more US troops and supplies began arriving. Soon, the airfield became a major base for the US and Kurdish forces, who worked together to push Saddam's army out of northern Iraq. Operation Northern Delay was a perfect airborne mission. The enemy was caught off guard. US forces landed safely, and the airfield was secured without major casualties. Now, this mission had 3 major impacts. First, it blocked Saddam's troops from escaping north. Without a safe retreat, his forces in Baghdad were trapped. Also, it gave the US a major foothold in Iraq. The captured airfield allowed thousands of US troops and vehicles to land safely. Thirdly, it proved airborne assaults were still effective in modern war. Many believed parachute drops were outdated, but this mission showed they could still be game changers. Just 2 weeks after the invasion, Baghdad fell, and Saddam Hussein's rule was over. The Iraq War, however, continued for years, leading to a long and complicated conflict. Their successful jump into Iraq was one of the last large-scale combat parachute drops in US history. Operation Northern Delay, 2003. In 1965, the US was deep into the Vietnam War, fighting against the Viet Cong, a guerrilla force from North Vietnam. The enemy was skilled at ambushes, booby traps, and jungle warfare. The Americans needed to hunt them down before they could attack. On November 5, 1965, 400 soldiers from the 173rd Airborne Brigade were sent into the jungle near Bien Hoa, South Vietnam. Their mission? Find and destroy a large Viet Cong force hiding in the area. They moved stealthily through the jungle, searching for enemy bases. At first, everything seemed quiet, but the Viet Cong were watching and waiting. By midday, the paratroopers walked into a trap. Hidden in the trees, over 1,200 Viet Cong soldiers suddenly opened fire. Bullets tore through the jungle. The Americans were outnumbered 3-1 and surrounded on all sides. The paratroopers fought back fiercely, trying to hold their ground. They called for airstrikes and reinforcements, but the jungle was thick and help couldn't come fast enough. For 8 brutal hours, the battle raged. The Viet Cong used hit-and-run tactics, disappearing into the jungle and then attacking again. The American soldiers ran low on ammo, but kept fighting. One of the most heroic moments came when Sergeants Larry Pierce and Charles Morris led counterattacks, trying to rescue their wounded men. Despite being wounded himself, Morris kept fighting and was later awarded the Medal of Honor. Finally, after a full day of battle, reinforcements arrived. US airstrikes and artillery forced the Viet Cong to retreat, but the damage was done. 49 American paratroopers had lost their lives, and over 100 were wounded. This operation was a painful lesson about jungle warfare. It showed that the Viet Cong were highly skilled and that the US needed better tactics to fight in the thick, unforgiving terrain. This battle was later honored in 8th of November, a song by country duo Big and Rich, inspired by the bravery of the 173rd Airborne soldiers. Even though the US would go on to fight for another decade in Vietnam, battles like this showed the incredible courage of airborne troops who fought in a war where the enemy was everywhere, and survival was never guaranteed. Operation Red Wings, 2005. While primarily a SEAL mission, airborne forces assisted in later phases of the operation, targeting the Taliban in Afghanistan. About 17,000 paratroopers during Operation Varsity, the largest single-day airborne assault of World War II. The mission: cross the Rhine and defeat the Nazis. By March 1945, World War II was nearing its end, but Germany was still fighting hard. The Rhine River was the last major obstacle before the Allies could march into the heart of Germany and defeat Hitler. To make the invasion successful, US and British forces needed to capture key bridges, destroy enemy defenses, and secure roads for tanks and troops. But the Germans knew this and were ready to fight. On March 24, 1945, over 17,000 US and British paratroopers from the US 17th Airborne Division and British 6th Airborne Division loaded into transport planes. Their mission: jump behind enemy lines near Wesel, Germany, and clear the way for the main invasion force. As they flew toward their target, German anti-aircraft guns opened fire. Planes were hit, some exploded mid-air, and others crashed. But the paratroopers knew they had to complete the mission. Once over the drop zones, the sky filled with parachutes. Thousands of troops landed under heavy enemy fire, but they fought back fiercely. The Germans had machine guns, artillery, and even tanks waiting for the paratroopers. Many landed right in the middle of battle and had to start fighting the moment they hit the ground. Despite heavy losses, the airborne troops captured key towns, secured bridges, and destroyed German artillery positions. Within hours, they had completed their mission. By the end of the day, the main Allied forces crossed the Rhine, pushing deep into Germany. Operation Varsity was a huge success, but it came at a cost. Over 2,000 Allied paratroopers were killed or wounded. However, their bravery helped speed up the end of World War II. Just 6 weeks later, on May 8, 1945, Germany surrendered, and the war in Europe was over. It's clear to note that Operation Varsity proved that airborne troops were one of the most powerful forces in modern warfare. It was the last major paratrooper assault of World War II, showing that soldiers dropping from the sky could change the course of history. Even today, it remains one of the largest and most successful airborne missions ever, a testament to the courage of those who fought to bring the war to an end.